Have you ever been overwhelmed with fear? Something bad's going to happen. You won't get everything done today. You're a bad parent, or maybe the task ahead of you, either with your kids or your job, is just too big to handle. We've all been there. I've been there. I know friends have been there, and I'm sure you've been there too. But as a young woman of only 19, Katie Davis Majors faced some extraordinary fears. She went to Africa, lived alone, and went on to adopt 15 kids by herself. Was she out of her mind? When I first heard about her, I wondered, and some would say so, but as you'll hear today, she wasn't. She felt that God encouraged her to go and to take in these 15 kids. It was overwhelming to her, but her story of how she coped and enjoyed the challenge is one you must hear. When it came to being afraid for her kids, she felt it. She wasn't a super religious person who was never afraid. Quite the opposite. She embraced her fear and asked God to help her, and he did. She chronicled her fears in her new book, Safe All Along, Trading Our Fears and Anxieties for God's Unshakable Peace. Let's hear her story. I am so excited today to have a remarkable young woman, Katie Davis Majors, on the podcast today. She has an extraordinary story, and her latest book is called Safe All Along, Trading Our Fears and Anxieties for God's Unshakable Peace. Katie, it's great to talk to you again.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here with you.
So you were just catching me up on all the things that you've been doing since we last talked and did an interview together. There are some people listening who may not know what you've done. They might not have read Kisses from Katie. So can you just give us a brief synopsis of what you did and what you started when you were 19?
Yeah. When I was 18, I went on a short-term mission trip to Uganda with my mom and just loved and was so captivated by the people and the beautiful, beautiful country, and made friends with a pastor and his family there who invited me to come back and stay with them for a year and do some volunteer work in an orphanage that they ran. And so when I was 18, I took a gap year between high school and college and moved over to Uganda for what I thought was going to be a year, but turned into much, much longer.
You went over to live by yourself at 19. That's important to say. That's extraordinary. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Well, yeah, my dad actually flew over with me, but he did leave me there. And I actually lived in this Ugandan family's home. They were super kind to me. I was working for them. And, as I was working in the orphanage, I was surprised to hear a lot of the children who lived there talking about their moms or their dads or their grandmas or their aunts or uncles. And I think coming from America, my kind of Western stereotype was that if you lived in an orphanage, your parents had died or they just didn't want you. And so I was surprised to hear these kids talk about their extended families. And so I started asking more questions and came to find out that a lot of children living in orphanages in East Africa actually have living parents and family members who are just too poor to take care of them. And so they send them to an orphanage, not because they don't want them or they don't love them, but because they don't have the resources that they need to care for them. And this was just really, really bothersome to me because the kids at the orphanage were not getting the best care that they could have been. The orphanage was understaffed. Sometimes there wasn't enough food. Sometimes there weren't enough resources to send all the kids to school. School in Uganda is expensive. And so I just started becoming friends with a lot of the people in my community and just really loved these people, loved my neighbors. And there were a couple of girls who were at risk of coming to live in the orphanage because their grandmother couldn't pay for them to go to school. And as I got to know this family, I just said, well, hey, if I could pay for them to go to school and maybe help you guys out with some food, would you still want to keep the girls at home with you? And she said, well, absolutely, yes. I just thought I couldn't afford to. And so I started paying for these two little girls to go to school. And then as I told my parents the story, they were like, well, okay, come on. How much does it cost? Like, we can probably pay for 5 kids to go to school. And I said, okay, great. And so kind of organically like that, they told a couple of their friends and my grandparents. And before I knew it, I had a whole group of people in the U.S. who were willing to pay the equivalent. I think at first we ended up kind of coming up with that it would cost between $30 and $40 a month to consistently send a child to school. And so had all kinds of friends and family here in the U.S. say like, oh, I'll give you that to send a child to school. And so within the first year of living in Uganda, I was volunteering and working in a little kindergarten program in the morning, but I was also just kind of independently sending 40 children to school, allowing them to stay with their families and still live at home, but go to school during the daytime. And after a lot of prayer, decided to turn it into a nonprofit and kind of make it official so that people had an official organization that they could send their money through. And I named the nonprofit Amazima. Amazima is the Luganda word for truth. And it became really important to me that these kids didn't just go to school and have meals provided for them and have medical care, but also that they would learn the truth of their Savior, Jesus. And so they would all come over and sit around on my little front porch in the evenings, and we would read the Bible together. And I would go and study the Bible with their parents and grandparents in their homes. And that is just kind of, I always say to people when they say like, oh, did you ever dream this could happen? I always say like, no, I didn't really. It was just kind of these little steps of obedience and doing the things that God put in front of me that grew into this big thing. And so today.
You adopted some kids as a single woman. Okay, so talk about your adoption.
Yeah, so a couple years into that as well, I began fostering 3 little girls who lived in the community that I was living in. They were actually children who I had been paying for them to go to school. And they were living in this really, really old, kind of worn down house. And the house fell down and the oldest one was injured. And they didn't have, the 2 little ones didn't have a place to stay. And so I said, okay, well, they can come stay with me. I had started renting a very small house in the same community because I needed a residential address to run my nonprofit out of. That was one of the requirements. And so I said, well, they can come stay with me until we figure out what we're going to do. And then while we were waiting on the oldest one to get out of the hospital, their grandmother also passed away. And so we very quickly realized that we didn't have another solution of people for them to go and live with. And so I began the process through the government of becoming registered as a foster parent. And having my home registered as a foster home so that I could foster them. And then after fostering them for several months, they started calling me mom. And I just, as I prayed and sought the Lord, I just really felt him saying to me like, yeah, you are going to be their mom. And the foster to adopt process in Uganda takes a long time. At the time that I was trying to go through it, it took 3 years at the very least. You had to foster for 3 years before you could formally adopt. But I began the steps toward adopting them with the intention that I would adopt them. And then similar situations happened several times. So I went on to adopt 13 children. They're all sibling sets. So they came in little groups of 3 and a couple groups of 2.
It's remarkable. At the time you were 19 and 20 years old and you had 13 kids, you said?
By the time I was 23, I had all 13 of them.
Oh, gosh. By yourself. You're not married. You didn't have friends over there. You're just over there, Katie Davis, by yourself, adopting all these kids and then making sure they go to school. I just wanted everybody to get the full picture. So, okay, so fast forward then. So you had all these kids and then fast forward what happened over the next few years.
Yeah, and I will say, I was, in a lot of ways, I was by myself. I will say, anybody who's been to Uganda or probably to different places in East Africa, the community, people just live very differently and very communally. And so in a way, I did have a ton of help and support just from neighbors and friends and community members. I felt like we had kind of a village cheering us on. And that's something I've really missed in our time back in the States. But we just always had extra people, extra kids and extra adults in and out of our home. And so in a lot of ways, while I was doing it alone, I didn't I didn't feel alone. But over the next several years, Amazima continued to grow. We now have multiple school campuses with lots and lots and lots of kids that come. We ended up building our own schools, and we have over 300 staff now there that I don't manage all of them, which I'm thankful for. We have really great leadership. I met my husband in Uganda, so he moved over a few years after me, and we met at a little Bible study that met in my home. Actually, he started coming to it, and he was there also doing missions work with a different organization. And so he and I just became friends, and we were friends for many years before we started dating and then got married. But yeah, God brought me my husband. Anytime I tell that story, I just think like, wow, how kind of God. Like, he knew what I needed, and he made something that I had really kind of thought was impossible.
Yeah.
He made it
there you are,
possible. And
sitting halfway across the world from all your friends and everything. Now, and you started schools. And how many schools did you start and when?
Okay, so we have, in Uganda, the education system is broken into primary and secondary. Primary is your first level of school, secondary is your second level of school. And so we have a primary school and a secondary school. So two different campuses, but they're kind of, it'd be similar to like a K through 12 kind of school here. It's just broken in half. And we started with the secondary school because what was happening was the kids that we were paying for schools, like we were paying for them to go to schools. And when they got to the secondary level, in order for them to go to a good school, we were having to send them to boarding schools that were pretty far from the village that they came from. And so we felt like we were losing a lot of like relational touch points with these kids at like this really crucial age of like 13, 14, 15 years old is kind of when you would start secondary school. And so we started with the secondary school, and that opened about 7 years ago. And then we just opened the primary school. We were ready to open it about 4 years ago, but then COVID shut down school in Uganda for almost 2 full years. And so we're just in our 3rd year of operating the primary school.
Wow. As we were saying, you've done more in your short years than most people do by the time they're 65. And I just want you to tell everybody too, you've gone through the painful separation of having a child leave home and go off to school, go off to college. Just touch on that for a minute, because having to experience that at your young age would be very, very hard.
Yeah, I mean, that part of parenting, I don't know. We've done all the stages of parenting in a really condensed time because some of our girls were adopted, obviously, when they were quite a bit older. And so we've done all the stages, from baby to adulthood kind of within this span of years. And I would venture to say that sending kids off to college and launching them into adulthood is maybe the hardest part of parenting, because here you've spent so many years just like trying to keep them safe and instill all these important things in them. And then, out they go, and you're just painfully aware of it was always God's to keep them safe, and you never were probably keeping them as safe as you thought you were. But now it's like glaringly apparent that you can't. And that has been really, really hard for me. And I mean, it's incredible because our daughters are so incredible, and they're like out in the world, and some of them are in college, and some of them are working, and some of them, one of them is married, and they're loving and serving their communities and finding their people and making friends and doing all these amazing things. And so it's like so wonderful and exciting, but it definitely leaves a big hole because, for me, for the last 15 or 16 years, so much of everything that I have has gone into mothering and raising up these children. And so, we still have 6 at home, but 6 feels really small in comparison, and so it has been difficult and just sad in a way. It's kind of an end of an era.
Yep. You're living in the U.S. You have 6 living at home.
Yes.
And are the older kids living in the U.S. as well, or are they back in Uganda?
Almost all of them are here. Our oldest is back in Uganda. She's working there. She's graduated from school here. And then all the rest of our girls are either in school or living in the Nashville area. So we're all close for now. And that was a big part of our move back to the States. We were entering a phase where we were pretty split, where almost half of them were over in the U.S. doing college in the Nashville area, and half of us were back in Uganda. And then we were going back and forth more because of that. And then, of course, COVID was making travel really hard. And so we, about a year and a half ago, made the decision to just kind of stay in the States for a time. And we don't know really if that'll be forever or if that'll just be for a little while. But I think I'm very aware of the fact that our years of all living together as a family are getting fewer. You know, I have no doubt that our girls will go out into all the world, you know. And so just kind of enjoying being in the same space for the time that we still have.
But that's a great segue into your book, Safe All Along, because I think as a parent, as a mother, you know, you draw these kids in as close as you can to yourself. And you, like, as you said, you believe you're keeping them safe. You're trying to protect them from everything. And then having them leave that, there's a fear that you have, an anxiety that you have that, have I done a good enough job, or what are they going to confront? Well, I love how Katie trusted God enough to help her fulfill his plans for her. And then how she learned to trust God at such a young age. That's enviable, friends. Well, when we come back, we're going to learn more about Katie's book, Safe All Along, and the transformational power of forgiveness. So don't go away. We'll be right back after this short break. Welcome back to PGK. My guest today is Katie Davis Majors. Katie's a missionary and now a wife and a mom of 15 kids. Before the break, we talked about Katie's journey of stepping in to what God called her to do as a missionary. Well, you may not be a missionary, but if you're a parent who struggles with fear and anxiety, like I think we all do, pay close attention. Let's get back to my interview with Katie. So talk now about how your book, Safe All Along, came. And because it's a fabulous book, by the way, everybody needs to read it. Your whole story is fabulous. But where did the book Safe All Along come from?
Yeah. So the idea for the book kind of came, I had been struggling with terrible anxiety that I had never felt before in my life. I mean, clearly here I am, like 19, moving to the other side of the world. Like I had my own struggles, but anxiety wasn't really something that I had dealt with. And after we launched our first kids into the world, and then we had a couple different medical things within our family that had us traveling a lot. And so my husband and I were kind of just traveling all over the place and not home a lot at the same time. And I think all of those things contributed. And I had just had a real struggle with anxiety, and God just gave me this picture. It was over Christmas break. So all our kids were home from college and everybody was at home. And so we decided to go on a family camping trip. And I talk about this in the intro of the book. And our family in Uganda, we lived right by the Nile River. And so one of our favorite kind of family activities was to go paddleboard or go kayak or go swim in the river. And so we went on this camping trip, and the first morning we were there, we decided to jump in the river and swim. We had life jackets on, and there was this current in the bay where we were staying, and it looked like it was circular. And so my husband and one of our older daughters jumped in, and the current was circular, so it kind of took them out and then brought them right back to shore, and looked really fun, like a water slide or something. And so I said to her, like, okay, come do it again with me. And I don't really know if we like overshot the current or if sometimes the current can kind of shift while you're in it. But regardless, within a couple minutes, we were not being taken back to shore. We were being taken out into the open river. And the Nile River is not a small river, and it is moving very, very, very fast. And so, so I was like swimming with all my might to the shore that was on the left of me, but simultaneously trying to reach out to the right of me because that's where my daughter was, and I wanted to grab her. And she was 18 or 19 at the time, so she was a good swimmer, but just, no matter how old they get, they're still your baby, and you still feel that you've got to get to them. So eventually I was able to climb out, but as I was climbing out, I could not reach my daughter, and I watched her get taken around the corner where I couldn't see her anymore. And so, a mother's worst nightmare, right? I mean, it felt like it could have been a scene out of a movie. And so I pulled myself up on this rock, and I was just panicking, and I was crying, and I was calling out to Jesus and just saying, Lord, please save her. And I was like trying to wave at my family, but they were now kind of far away. Like we had gone far down the river. Yeah. And I saw them kind of head over to me. And so I sat there waiting, thinking like, okay, they're going to get over here to me. And like, I've got to figure out, like, what are we going to do? And how are we going to find my daughter? And, all the worst case scenarios are going through your head. And suddenly I heard footsteps coming from the opposite direction of where my family was. And I saw her swimsuit, and I just felt this relief wash over me. And I grabbed onto her, and I was like, are you okay? And she was very nonchalant about it. She was like, yeah, Mom, I'm fine. And then her sisters got over there, and she was like, okay, haha, maybe we won't swim anymore. And they just kind of bounced away, like, you okay, Mom? You good? Okay, awesome. We're going to go play cards. So I'm like playing it cool, like, yeah, guys, you're right. It wasn't a big deal. But when my husband found me and I hugged him, I mean, I just fell apart, and I was just sobbing, I'm so sorry. I thought I lost her. I thought we had lost her. And so he let me have my moment and fall apart for a little bit. And then he said, hey, I want to show you something. And he grabbed my hand, and he took me further up on the riverbank where it went way up high on this hill. And we were standing up there on the hill, and you could look down and you could see the whole river. Like from way up high above, you could see all the twists and turns. And he started to point out all these different places, because I had said to him when I was hugging him, like, did you think we were going to die? And he was like, well, no, I didn't. But like, let me show you why. And so he pointed out, look, there's a little island right there. Maybe she could have swam to that. And here's a little bay over here where the water is really still. And she probably could have rested there. And there were all these different ways that she would have been able to get out and be safe. And I just felt the Lord, like it just dropped into my spirit, this phrase, we were safe all along. And suddenly, like from way up high where we could see the whole picture, my like panic and fear that I had felt a few minutes ago in the river felt like totally silly and ridiculous. Like, like we were fine and you were freaking out. And I just thought back over the last years of our life and all of the things that had sent me kind of just spinning in anxiety, and all the times that I had just been really, really panicking. And like, here we were out in the beauty of God's creation on this family camping trip. Yes, we'd been through some hard times. We were a little bit banged up and bruised, but like, we were all okay, and we were all still together. And like God had carried us through that season, and he had not left us. And I just thought like, wow, what a picture of our lives, that like so often we are down in the rapids, if you will, right? We just have this one perspective, and we can only see what we can see. And a lot of times what we can see looks scary and disastrous and chaotic, but we have a God who can see the whole picture from above, and he knows the path that he has us on, and he knows how he's going to get us to safety, and how he's going to carry us, and how he's not going to leave us. And I just thought, wow, what would my life look like if I really lived as if I believed that to be true? And like, yeah, intellectually, I believe that to be true, but what would it look like to really like deep in my heart and in my spirit and my body live as if I believed that that was true, that my one perspective, as scary as it seems, like it isn't the ultimate perspective.
Well, even if you would have, for instance, when your daughter's going down the stream away from you and you're convinced she's going to drown, and you prayed and you cried out to the Lord, if you would have had a different perspective, like your husband had high up on that hill, you probably would have felt a lot more peace, because you go, look, I can't see her. she's probably in a horrific situation, but I know God sees her, and he's going to do something, that it's going to turn out well somehow, some way. Have you been able to get to that point over since the time she was going down the river and you thought she was drowning? Are you able to live with that very different perspective on a heart level?
I mean, it's a work in progress, right? I would
Yeah.
say a lot of the times I am, and I'm much better at it today than I was then. You know, it's kind of funny. So that picture gave me the idea for this book. And I went to my publishing team and I was like, okay, I have this idea. This is the book I want to write next. And then just months later is when we kind of unexpectedly made the move to the United States. And talk about difficulty and anxiety. You know, I had essentially done a lot of my like formative young adult years in Uganda. I moved there straight out of my parents' home. I had never lived alone before. All the things that you learn to do as an adult, you know, get your oil changed or pay your water bill or all these different things, I learned in the context of Uganda. And so moving back to America as an adult, married, with children, with a job, I didn't know how to do anything. I mean, I was back in my home country, but I felt like I had moved to a foreign country. And so then my anxiety was higher than it had ever been. And so I went back to my publisher and I was like, never mind, I can't write this book. I don't know anything about this.
Yeah.
But I had a good friend say to me, you know, Katie, people don't always want to learn from an expert. Sometimes they just want to they want to learn through someone who's living it and walking it out. And I said, like, okay, well, if that's true, I am going to have to walk this out because I can't just be panicking forever. Right. And so, you know, in the book, I feel like as I wrote, God taught me and he spoke to me. And I hope that transferred on the pages and will speak to other people. And he gave me a lot of kind of practical things that help me to be more intentional, to just kind of put on that piece. You know, we're told to put on the armor of God and just to put that on and to try to live out of it each day. And so I think I have a lot more practical tools now that I still catch myself, you know, when my thoughts start to kind of spiral and I'm starting to think of, well, what if this and what if that and then what? And that can really lead to a lot of anxiety. But I feel like I've learned to interrupt those thoughts with these different practices that God has given me, like memorizing scripture or spending some time surrendering these things and talking to him about them, or going on a walk, you know, simple things, but things that have helped me kind of interrupt that thought process so that it doesn't overtake my day.
Because I know that there are a lot of people listening who have tremendous amount of anxiety. Anxiety is a horrible feeling. And, you know, as they listen and they would think, well, how in the world could you have anxiety? Look what you did. You went over to Uganda, you adopted these kids, you started a school, and then you came back here. So the book is it fair to say the book was written during your time of dealing with that anxiety? Or do you feel by the time you started writing the book, you were pretty much past it?
No, I would say that the book was written very much out of a place of me kind of dealing with and walking through, okay, Lord, how am I going to overcome this? And how are you going to help me overcome it?
So what tools specifically, because as I said, there are people out there listening who have a lot of anxiety. So tell us some of the steps that you went through. Obviously, it was prayer. And you said, okay, Lord, I can't deal with this. I don't know what to do. I know you have a very different perspective of my life. But talk to us about some really concrete things that you did that other people could use that really got you over the hump of anxiety.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, I say this in the book and I'll say it here too for anybody listening. I do go to therapy quite often, and I've been blessed to have some really great therapists, and so I really advocate for that. I've also taken medication during different seasons in my life, and so I never want to present these practices and tools as like, okay, this is going to be a fix-all, because I think that God gives us amazing people in therapists that have studied in ways that we haven't, and He even gives us the tools of modern medicine. And so I would want anybody listening who struggles with anxiety to know and to hear it from me, like, it is okay to get the help that you need. And those are both tools that have really helped me, in addition to this path that I'm walking and that I share about in the book. One thing that I talk about, I go through in the book 10 different practices that have helped me. And so the first half of the book is kind of my journey through anxiety, and the second half is kind of these 10 practical things that I hope people can take away, because I like to read books where I leave with like, okay, here's some stuff that I can do about it. And so I'll share a few of those here. So I talk a lot about just spending time with God, and not both spending time in His Word, but also just spending time speaking to Him and pausing to listen to what He might say. And a big part of that for me, when I talk about conversing with God, a big part of that for me has been memorizing Scripture, because when I memorize Scripture, then I have His Word already in my heart and my mind. And so if I'm having a particularly anxious moment and I say to God, what do you want me to do? Or God, what do you think about this? I can recall to my mind His Word, and that is His voice to me. And I believe He gives us His Word to equip us. And so the more that I have Scripture memorized, the more it comes to my mind in times of anxiety. And there have been seasons of life where I have memorized a psalm, and every time that I start to have an anxious thought, or I start to feel kind of pulled down that spiral, you know how kind of one anxious thought can lead to another, can lead to another, can lead to another. And within a few minutes, you have some terrible situation in your brain and you're crying about it, and you're like, that's not happening. That's not even real.
You go down, you go down the big dark hole, and it's hard to get out. So that's pretty neat. So you memorize Scripture. We only have a couple minutes left. Everybody needs to read the book, because you give so many practical tools. You don't just tell an extraordinary story, but you give very practical tips. So if you can quickly just run through a couple of them: training our hearts to praise, practicing presence, creating space for rest. Talk about embracing forgiveness. Why is that in there?
Well, that's funny, because I was turning in the book and that chapter wasn't in there, and I went on a hike, and I felt like the Lord just impressed it upon my heart that actually we can't live in His peace if we are still walking in unforgiveness. And so, what does it look like to really extend genuine forgiveness? What does it look like to really receive genuine forgiveness? And then what does it look like to forgive ourselves? And I think especially as a parent who has adult children, I am my own worst critic. And it's been a journey for me to learn not just to forgive others, but to forgive myself for mistakes I made when I didn't know better. And I think just imagining the forgiveness that Jesus has offered us makes it impossible not to forgive those who have wronged us. Because when I feel and understand how deeply I have been forgiven, it challenges me to forgive others even when I've really been wronged, and to have those hard conversations, because sometimes we can't just forgive in our minds. We have to actually have the conversation and walk that out with people. And so I talk about that, and then I just talk about repentance as well, when we need to be forgiven. I love that, you talk about forgiving yourselves, because I think parents do that all the time. The things that we say to ourselves in our heads are so rude. We're so rude to ourselves, particularly parents, because we ruminate on, well, I should have done that. And why did I do this? And why did I take my daughter to the river? What if it would have done this? And, and it's a horrible thing to do. And when we refuse to forgive
ourselves from making mistakes or even thinking we made mistakes, it's really throwing our fist at God and saying, well, you can forgive me, but I'm not going to forgive me. And that's it's a wrong thing to do. Your book is so beautiful, Katie. I could do 4 interviews with you, but we've run out of time. Your story is extraordinary, but what I love is that you're so real and you're so vulnerable because God has really given you to other people to help them understand his love and his grace. And what you write about is so real. And that's why I encourage every parent or person or even child listening to our interview today to go out and read your book. Thank you for being you. Thank you for obeying God. And thanking you for blessing us and teaching us how to live with a really painful experience, fear and anxiety that I know are going to help so many people.
Thank you.
Parents, I am so glad you tuned in today. Whether you have 1 child or 15 or maybe no kids, like Katie, you have had a burden that's heavy. And I hope this interview showed you that you're not alone in the process, and it reminded you that God has a perspective so much bigger than we do, but we can't see it in the moment. So if you're going through a challenging time, don't be afraid to pray or reach out to a friend. But also, like Katie said, there's no shame in supporting yourself by going to a counselor or taking prescription medication for your mental health. In order to be the best parent you can be, you need to make sure that you take care of yourself too. Now let's go to my points to ponder. 1, accept that you're afraid. When we're afraid, most of us pretend we aren't, even to ourselves. This is ridiculous, we tell ourselves. And when friends ask if we're anxious or frightened, we usually say, oh no, not really. Feeling fear is a normal response to many situations, and feeling depressed is a normal response as well. If we never felt afraid, we wouldn't be able to protect ourselves or our kids. So when you feel your blood pressure go up, that queasy feeling on the inside, ask yourself, what specifically am I afraid of? 2, determine if your fear is based in reality or not. Sounds kind of odd. But when children fear monsters under the bed, their fear is real. But if we can convince them over time to see that monsters aren't real, their fear will dissipate. When the same way we fear things that are highly unlikely to happen. What if my child gets leukemia? What if my child gets in an accident where he's paralyzed? What if his girlfriend dumps him? What if he's burned in a house fire? We reel with fear. Do these things happen? Yes. But if we became afraid of every single danger our kids might encounter, we'd never let them out of the house. 3, pause and pray. Fear does something to our nervous system and also to our thinking. Once we get anxious, we ruminate on it and it gets worse and worse. We take ourselves down that bad rabbit hole. When fear hits, in the midst of the awful feeling, take a deep breath. Sit. Accept that your fear is real. Lay it out and then ask God to take the worry on. This is really hard to do and it takes time. I have a little trick I do when I'm really afraid. I say, I'm going to allow myself to worry all day except from 6 to 8 o'clock at night. And God, will you take my fear from 6 to 8 at night? And then at 8:01, I'll pick my fear up again and worry as much as I want. That was a little trick that helped me get past all of my fear. So it takes a trust in God that he will actually help. If we learned anything from Katie today, it's this: no matter how big your fear is, trust God. He'll give you an answer. It may not be in the form that you want, but he is there. He has enormous shoulders, and he'll carry it with you if you're strong enough to trust him. I want to give a very special thank you to my guest today, Katie Davis Majors. If you want to learn more about Katie, which you should, go to her website by typing in katiedavismajors.com. From there, you can also order Katie's latest book, Safe All Along. Friends, it's a fabulous read. Again, the website is katiedavismajors.com. Now let's recap my 3 points to ponder. 1, accept that you're afraid. 2, determine if your fear is based in reality or not. 3, pause and pray. Friends, I really want you to know that if you need help or encouragement or answers to any questions about your kids or your fears about them, go to meekerparenting.com. I have courses, tips, blogs, and more to help you. And if you know a dad who needs encouragement, while you are there, check out my brand new Strong Fathers, Strong Daughters Masterclass. And always remember, great kids are raised, not born.